and welcome to Those in the Back, The Sidelining of Black Women's Suffrage by Samuel Baker, Gabriela Rojas, and Isaac Bennett. Today we will be talking about how the women's suffrage movement was an early example of the racial divide within the feminist movement, as African American women were regulated to the sideline with open racism. This topic was interesting to us. Myself, I always love learning more about the history of the different feminist movements. Samuel was unfamiliar with the whitewashing of this particular part of history, and Isaac is one to believe that it is too overlooked on behalf of African American women.
So to kind of give some background here, this is Sam, by the way, on the variety kind of that went with the women's suffrage unit. We're going to go a little bit before where our class actually started, and right where the beginning of suffrage. So the first time it took first women's rights convention, it's not really the first, but it's the one that we marked down, was in 1848 at a building. This isn't the actual building, it's a reconstruction of it. It's actually like 3 blocks away from where I grew up. And the big thing here is eventually this all coalesced into the 19th Amendment, which is in the top right there. It was first originally put forward to Congress in 1878, was not ratified for 41 years, with quite a few different methods of trying to fight to get this ratified. And quite a bit was coming forward. Like a good example is in the bottom right here, and this is just a small group from the Oklahoma Women's Suffrage Association. It's just first you want farmers, second you want socialists, third you want laborers, and then fourth of all you need women of all classes need education. Now this isn't necessarily, and I put this up there because it's not a standard reaction that you hear out of the suffrage, but it's one that was existed because there's a whole lot of like small grassroots groups that were all across the country, and when we'll address some of the larger ones that came in, but the main movement can be split up into 3 different categories. You got state level voting rights, legal action, and militant action. State level voting rights. So as time progressed here, most of women's suffrage actually really originated from the West, strangely enough, at least at the state. 9 Western states had already adopted it by 1912. And it's kind of interesting as to the reasons why this might have been the case. A lot of it is because there were women who actually had more access to land out there because their husband died. So there was a little bit of that. Some of it was legislation wanted to encourage more women to come out in general just because there weren't enough. Others had women's rights in mind. Certainly that was a thing. And then also there was Utah, which is especially unique because it was very much wrapped up in the question of polygamy that went on, and had suffrage even prior to statehood, which is interesting. Legal challenges. This is very much reminiscent of the civil rights period, and for African Americans as well. So you have the Minor v. Happersnap case, which came forward and actually tried to justify the right for women to vote based off of the 14th Amendment. But 14th Amendment, the one that gave the right to vote to African Americans. But the Supreme Court decided that suffrage wasn't a right of citizenship, therefore the 14th Amendment didn't give women the right to vote, and it was struck down. There was quite a few legal challenges on this, one of which was even Susan B. Anthony, which is a little more well-known. And hers was based off of a very militant action that she had at that time. Up in the top right, this comes out of actually that case. It's like the only chance for a woman to do justice in this country is to violate the law, as I have done, and she'll continue to do. Basically, she was arrested for attempting to vote, fined for voting illegally, and then basically just never paid the fine and told everybody off on that regard. But she wasn't the only one in that regard. Like there's a certain amount of militancy that was certainly in this. There was sit-ins, there's picketing. In fact, the very first picket, which was outside of Woodrow Wilson's place in 1912 or 1917, by a more radical group led by Alice Paul. So that's kind of a quick background, very quick, as far as where we're coming from within the suffrage groups here, because everybody's kind of working together, but they all have their own minds and ideals as far as going forward. Now, here's the thing: for the very beginning, racial politics polluted women's suffrage. So federal and state arguments had constantly been kind of going back and forth on this, and there had even been some propositions in the South, like down in Mississippi. It's like, do we include the women's rights, women's suffrage, to be able to outbalance the African American vote? But and at the federal level, you have lines like this from Pennsylvania Democrat in the federal House: if the Negro has the right to vote because he is a human inhabitant of community professing to be a Republican, then women should vote for the same reason. Some of the reformers do say that the Negro will come to women, and I protest the inverse of the order of merit. If both I if both are to vote, I claim precedence for the ladies. So this is very much in line with the Democratic Party at the time. And obviously, in his case, he imagined all women would be white in this case overall. And then you've even got Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the other side, which she was pretty racist in the way that she put herself forward and lead even further into it as time went on. So you've got her organization and her and Susan B. Anthony, which started originating out of that initial suffrage meeting, which they had both attended. You got the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they're complicated because what ended up happening is they actually alienated a lot of themselves because of their racial tilt, and a lot of that racial tilt came out after they had gotten funding, or at least it became much more noticeable and broadcasted to everybody after they had gotten funding from a man named George Francis Train, who was a wealthy Democrat philanthropist and eventual presidential hopeful who had offered to fund a paper for Stanton and Anthony. Strangely enough, this is also the guy who inspired Jules Verne's around the world in 80 days. The thing is about Train, 100% was a hardline Democrat at the time who's an unapologetically racist and was quoted as saying "women first, Negro last." And this caused many of Stanton and Anthony's allies to question like where they're coming from, because a lot of the suffragists who had been abolitionists before the Civil War, and then there's complication on that because some were just some sort of like shrugged their shoulders and moved on because they're like, well, they're no longer slaves, so do we need to do much more? While others like were still trying to go for like equal rights. They were certainly in the mix. The revolution and a lot of the things that Stanton was writing was really problematic. So Stanton used to use the threat of violence on black men on white women as a justification for white women's vote. It's very much basically the whole image of the black rapist on the white woman, and she was co-opting that to be able to get Southern white voters to sort of join into her group and move the suffrage unit forward. And Anthony was generally quiet for a while, but she is completely not without blame here as well. And due to this, a number of people who were very much in the NWSA before, including Lucy Stone, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Frederick Dulles, who actually attended the very first convention, they ended up breaking off and creating the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was much more liberal, and it tried to incorporate everybody else, but they're notable because they were the second largest group, but they specifically focused on the vote. They didn't go so much into the civil rights things. And this is kind of like the white majority that just wants to take like a neutral position on the race. This is like this group aside from like Frederick Dulles. So they didn't tend to get, and their whole thing was like, we're just about suffrage and suffrage for everyone. Now, again, as time went on, they argued back and forth. You got these two major groups and everything, but that argument only went until 1890, until they combined back into NWSA, which became this the large group that ended up driving the rest of the ratification forward, which didn't happen until 1918, as I said earlier. But here's the thing: it's like not everybody was able to participate in NWSA. People were black women who were also part of the suffrage groups. There were these small groups as well that we will get into in just a moment. They were all pushed off to the side because they wanted to keep the Southern Democratic vote to be, or some Southern Democratic women's support for the group. And while the bylaws of the group allowed African American participation, local groups could make up their own rules, and most of them just said no, which caused, is obviously a tragedy as far as that goes. Go ahead, Gabby.
Okay, so one of the major groups that came about from the few groups that were okay with having racism within their NASA group would be the NACW, which is the National Association of Colored Women. The founders were Ida B. Wells, Frances E.W. Harper, who was one of Anthony's former supporters, and Harriet Tubman and Mary Church Terrell. Now, this group, they were not strictly focused on the vote. It was one of the things that they really wanted, but they were also looking at things that were important to African Americans that were just a part of everyday life. Job training, wage equity, childcare. They were a big part of the anti-lynching movements within their communities. Peonage, so working for free, hard labor with no pay, which for some reason people were still getting away with. Prison conditions were horrendous, even just for everyone. And then segregated transportation was another big thing that they looked into a lot. They had to get places, and segregated transportation just wasn't doing it. But even as protesters and looking at things politically, they were also very much a community service group. They looked into their communities and aiding the sick and injured, and even opening up homes for the elderly, providing education, because they knew that sending children to a school or sending even adults to evening school, they weren't going to get a good education because their education was not going to be put as much of a priority. And then they provided clothing and housing. They funded for schools and summer camps. They funded entire kindergartens. And then most importantly, they mobilized Black voter drives to help the men who had already gotten their vote actually get to vote and actually get to use it. And then along with the education and even at the voter drives, they would promote public cultural events with people reading and doing prose and poetry. And they're just very involved in their community, and they didn't just they didn't have tunnel vision with the voting. They wanted it, but they knew they also needed to help their community, and they did that as a group. They felt that it was the responsibility of those who are privileged to help those who were socially inferior or not doing as well as they were. They also supported the women's suffrage movement 2 years before the General Federation of Women's Clubs. Next slide. All right, and then we have, getting back to the NAWSA and their pocketed racism, they actually had Susan B. Anthony said at a suffragette march, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman." So she said she wasn't racist. Frederick Douglass said she wasn't racist. But I think, like many people at the time, they did see that they were more of a priority, or she would have those bits of racial bias come out if she got too heated. And that's where some of these Susan B. Anthony quotes come from, where we see her not in the best light. after the formation of NASA, Susan B. Anthony and other white Southern suffragists continued to choose expediency over loyalty and justice. Or sorry, I said Northern. Or I said Southern, I meant Northern. Northern white suffragists were no longer supporting their African American counterparts as much as they had pre-Civil War or during Reconstruction era. They found it more, well, they found it better to support their Southern counterparts, who they felt were going to be a better advantage of having versus African American counterparts. So they held conventions excluding Black women. They forced them to march separately or in the back of suffrage parades. At the 1913 march in Washington, D.C., there was estimates of 5,000 to 10,000 women. It was organized by formerly mentioned Alice Paul. And Alice Paul actually requested that the Black suffragettes march at the back so as not to alienate the Southerners. Now, Ida B. Wells, one of the founders of NACW, refused to do this. She did not want to march segregated. She knew they were all there for a reason and that there was no point in them pulling themselves apart if they were all working for the same goal. So while everyone else complied and went to the back or stood to the side and didn't march, Wells went to the front and marched with the other white Illinois delegates who were there. Now there's 500,000 onlookers approximately, so it was a pretty small parade compared to the crowd. And the violence ensued. There was fights that broke out, and after all of this, or at the same time, President Woodrow Wilson is pulling into the train station expecting crowds, and he doesn't get that because everyone's at the march. Everyone is more concerned about this march than the arrival of President Wilson. And he wasn't really for supporting the whole movement at first, but he did eventually somewhat come on board. And now we will have Isaac talking about the modern movement.
Hello. So basically, I will be talking about how modern feminism isn't just about the African American movement, but is a combination of movements that basically have the same goal and motive, or essentially want close to the same things. For example, there was an LGBTQ plus a march that is basically fighting for pride and for different laws to be placed. And then next slide. So then basically, in this one, I'll be talking about the modern feminism room and the room for improvement. Modern marches usually have a problem within the march or when it comes to running an organization or organizing the marches. The race is a big part of it, and how sometimes people don't allow colored people to be able to run or be in charge of the marches and the information that entails that. In 2017, there was a women's march that took place in Seattle, Washington, that was accused of being mostly white and never encountering police in riot gear, never having to wipe away pepper spray. They never feared getting arrested, and some were posing with police officers that were wearing pink pussy hats. Groups like the International Women's Development Agency, or IDWA, and the Women's March are just trying to get people to understand that they desire creation of a new society that respects all life and that is free of discrimination by gender, race, sexuality, or religion. A quick quote is, but as the feminist movement struggles to become more diverse and open, many concerns need to be addressed, need to tackle the liberalism of the historic feminist movement which has too often fought for a place for white women at the expense of black ones. And that is I believe it's Tanisha Kenny. Next slide, Sam.
And where? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, at this current time, the African American feminist movement has taken the form of the current movement called the Black Lives Matter movement. I believe the reason why the feminist movement has changed and is now warped into the Black Lives Matter movement was that over time, African Americans have developed new personalities and personas. This allows Black people to show their spirit and prove that they are not a threat to society. Humans are afraid of things that they cannot understand. I believe that in order to change America, we need to come to the same idea so that we can build more things and better things. A couple of quotes that I believe fit with what I'm talking about. First one's from Martin Luther King Jr. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Next one by Malcolm X. The future belongs to those who prepare for it today. That's it.
And yeah, and that's kind of the biggest thing that and you can hop in here too, Gabby, as I mean, everything's going crazy outside right now with the protests, but understand that as he went back before with the white women marching in, everybody was totally for it, and everybody's wearing hats, and it's all cute kumbaya. But if it was all black women marching, it might have been entirely a problem. Like, as soon as it's about African Americans, like, suddenly there's contention to it. And that was the case then. That is the case now.
Yeah.
And that is kind of the big issue as far as this goes.